A Belgian mining company called it a temporary assignment. The Congo Basin called it a death sentence. In 1931, 8 laborers were left to maintain a copper extraction camp deep inside one of the most punishing stretches of jungle in Central Africa. No roads out, no clean water source, and a radio transmitter nobody among them had ever been trained to touch. One man was recovering from a surgery that hadn't finished healing. The supply truck disappeared around the bend. The tree line swallowed the sound of its engine. And the real danger wasn't the jungle. It was being erased on purpose. From a distance, the Katanga interior appears almost engineered to make human ambition look ridiculous. The humidity never breaks. Rain arrives without warning and leaves the ground so saturated that anything you build begins sinking before you finish building it. There is no clean river you can trust, no high ground that stays dry long enough to matter. The jungle has its own economy of decay, where everything organic gets reclaimed so fast you can watch it happen if you sit still long enough. The place doesn't feel hostile exactly. It feels indifferent, which is worse. Hostility at least acknowledges you exist. In the late 1920s, a Belgian extraction company operating under a name that sounded like progress, Compagnie Centrale des Métaux, set its ambitions on a stretch of copper-rich land in the southern Congo. The deposits were real. The profit projections were better than real. They were intoxicating. The company was run by 2 directors, Henri and Marcel Deveau, administrators who understood spreadsheets with the devotion that other men reserve for religion. They recruited laborers from Belgium's industrial northwest and from the Congolese interior itself, men who understood hard physical work and the specific exhaustion of earning your survival through your hands. For one season, the operation looked like exactly what the directors had promised their investors. Ore moved, equipment functioned, numbers climbed in the right direction. The brothers, far away, had figures to admire. If there is a particular blindness among certain kinds of businessmen, it is the belief that distant places exist primarily as inputs. The following year, they returned with expanded crews and larger ambitions. Workers arrived not only from Belgium but from neighboring territories, pulled by wages that seemed substantial until you measured them against what was being asked in return. Over 200 men worked a site that the land itself was quietly rejecting. The operation ran smoothly until a flooding event submerged the primary storage facility and destroyed the majority of the food reserves, medicine, and dry goods that had been warehoused for the season. An event that should have functioned as a warning from the jungle itself. Flooding in the Katanga interior is not like flooding elsewhere. It doesn't inconvenience you. It restructures the mathematics of survival. In a place without markets or gardens, losing stores isn't a setback. It's the start of a clock counting down towards something nobody wants to name out loud.
When the season closed in February 1931, the company organized its equipment, its product, and its workforce for the return journey. But the extraction infrastructure remained. The machinery represented capital. The reinforced storage buildings represented investment. The copper deposits would still be there next season. Someone, the regional administrator decided, should stay through the dry season to guard the equipment, perform maintenance, and prevent the jungle from undoing what the company had built. 8 people agreed to stay, 7 men and 1 woman, Marguerite, whose husband was among the 7 and who refused to leave without him. What persuaded them is difficult to reconstruct from the fragmentary records that survived. Perhaps genuine loyalty, perhaps the particular kind of optimism that only exists before experience corrects it. The company promised resupply within 90 days. It left them preserved rations for 6 weeks, 3 goats, a small medical kit missing half its contents, and the confident assurance that the company honored its commitments. There was also a radio, which sounded like a lifeline and functioned like a prop. Not one of the 8 knew how to operate it. The truck convoy pulled away. The jungle noise filled the space the engines left behind. The 8 stood in the mud and watched civilization retreat around a bend in the road. In the beginning, the countdown felt manageable. 90 days is nothing. It is a bad quarter, an uncomfortable stretch, a story you tell at dinner when you get home. They organized their routines. They maintained the equipment as instructed. They rationed carefully, knowing the rations were thin but believing the arithmetic would hold long enough for the truck to return. The goats wandered the perimeter. The men hunted and gathered what the jungle offered on its own terms, which were unpredictable and frequently insufficient. They learned how the site flooded in the afternoon rain and dried by morning. They learned which sounds at night were animals and which were just a jungle talking to itself. They learned how quickly boredom becomes a physical condition, pressing on your chest from the inside. Marguerite went into labor on the 41st day. There is something specifically brutal about childbirth in a place like the Katanga interior, where the ground never fully dries and the nearest medical facility is days of travel away. Marguerite delivered a daughter, Claire, among men who were miners and laborers, not doctors or midwives, with nothing beyond basic supplies and the improvised competence of people who had no alternative. The child survived her first week. She did not survive her second month. Malnutrition, fever, infection. The causes overlap and reinforce each other the way misfortunes do in places where margin does not exist. Each one survivable in isolation. Together they are inescapable. The 8 buried the infant in red Katanga soil that offered no softness for the occasion. There were no flowers to speak of, no proper materials for a marker. The jungle in that region has a particular talent for making grief feel unresolved. By May, the 90 days had expired. By June, the expiration had curved into something that felt personal. The preserved rations were nearly gone. The men hunted continuously now, eating bushmeat and whatever the jungle offered, supplementing with the remaining goats slaughtered one by one as the challenger stretched in directions nobody had planned for. Canned goods that had seemed like a reasonable supplement became the primary nutritional architecture of their existence, which was a problem nobody had yet fully articulated, but which the bodies of the 8 were beginning to articulate on their own. On June 29th, one of the men, Armand, began showing symptoms that none of them recognized immediately. Fatigue in that camp was baseline. Everyone was tired. Everyone hurt somewhere. Everyone had dropped weight they could not afford to lose. But Armand's legs began to swell in a way that fatigue doesn't explain. His gums bled when he ate. Small cuts from the jungle work refused to close. The others watched with the specific helplessness of people who can see a problem clearly and cannot locate a solution anywhere in their environment. They found the medical pamphlet at the bottom of the kit and read it by lamplight. The diagnosis it offered felt like something from another century. Scurvy. Scurvy does not announce itself the way a sudden illness does. It does not arrive overnight and declare its intentions. It is a slow, structural failure, the body quietly losing its ability to hold itself together at the molecular level because it has been deprived of something so basic that civilized life made it invisible. Vitamin C, fresh food, living plants. The kind of nutrition that appears automatically in any normal diet and disappears completely in a camp surviving on canned protein and salted reserves. Sailors from wooden ship centuries had understood this in the hardest possible way. The 8 in Katanga were relearning it in 1931, decades after the lesson should have been obsolete. The jungle surrounded them with green abundance that was not the kind of abundance they needed. Armand worsened across 2 weeks and died. The jungle took him without any particular ceremony. It takes everything that way. Shortly after, a second man, Bernard, showed the same progression of symptoms. By this point, the survivors understood the disease well enough to watch it unfold with a terrible clinical clarity. Understanding what is happening to someone and being unable to change it is one of the more specific forms of suffering available to human beings. Bernard died in late July, 7 months after the last convoy had driven away. In the weeks that followed, Marguerite's husband, Edward, weakened and died as well. 7 had become 4, and the 4 were not healthy. They existed in a contracting circle of daily necessity, each decision shaped by diminishing resources and diminishing bodies. Whether to use the remaining ammunition on an animal today or conserve it for a better opportunity tomorrow. Whether to risk the unstable northern section of the site where a recent collapse had made movement dangerous. Whether to slaughter the last goat and accept the hunger that decision permanently installed in the future. Hunger restructures your relationship with time. It makes the present enormous and the future theoretical. On that site in Katanga, abstract questions about ethics or fairness, or what the company owed them, had been replaced entirely by immediate physical calculation. The negotiation was between the body and the next meal, conducted in silence.
September arrived with the particular cruelty of a month that resembles October in the way that false hope resembles real hope. One of the 4 remaining men, Gerard, took his tools to the eastern perimeter of the site, where the copper vein ran closest to the surface. The ground there had been unstable since the flooding. He did not return by evening. By morning, it was clear he was not going to. There was no search. There were 3 people barely functional, and a jungle that does not give back what it absorbs. Gerard's absence reduced them to 3: Marguerite, a man named Jules, and a man named Theo. In Belgium, the world was reorganizing itself around financial catastrophe. The Depression had arrived with the specific brutality of a system consuming its own foundations. Companies that had operated as though the future were a fixed address were discovering that the future was more of a suggestion. Somewhere inside this institutional panic, the 8 workers left in the Katanga interior had become a line in a ledger, an obligation whose urgency could be quietly reassessed. Months passed. The site stayed empty of help. The jungle kept its own schedule, indifferent to European financial calendars.
On January 14, 1932, 11 months after the last convoy had departed, the company's next seasonal operation finally reached the site with new workers and new equipment. The crew foreman expected to find a tired but functional guard team. What he found were 3 survivors in the condition that prolonged starvation and isolation produce in human beings. Tissue depleted to the structural minimum, eyes occupying too much space in faces that had lost the flesh surrounding them, voices reduced to something that required effort to produce. They could not form sentences immediately. They communicated first by gesture, pointing toward the places in the jungle and the red soil where the others had been buried or lost. The arriving crew used the word skeletal in their report, a word that tends to sound dramatic until you understand that it is meant literally, that the body had consumed its reserves so completely that what remained was the minimum required architecture of a living person. Rescue should have been a conclusion. It was not. Jules boarded the return convoy and left. Marguerite and Theo did not. Whether the company applied pressure, whether survival had restructured their sense of what was tolerable, whether Depression-era Belgium felt as incomprehensible and dangerous as staying, the records do not offer a clean explanation. What they do make clear is that the operational logic of the company did not pause to absorb what had just been found. The copper deposits were still there. The season was beginning. The machinery, some of it functional, some of it requiring repair, represented investment. Marguerite and Theo apparently represented available labor. The following operational season brought in new workers, predominantly from neighboring territories, men pushed by economic conditions into accepting terms that a better market would have rejected. Their diet was built around what could be caught or scavenged on site, supplemented by whatever the company provisioned, which was not enough and was not designed with nutritional completeness in mind. The jungle, having already demonstrated what it does to people on inadequate diets, demonstrated it again. This time the deficiency was different. Beriberi, caused by the absence of thiamine, vitamin B1, a nutrient that disappears when a diet collapses into polished grain and preserved protein with nothing living to balance it. Beriberi comes in 2 forms. The wet form attacks the cardiovascular system, flooding the body from within. The dry form destroys peripheral nerves, reducing muscle control until movement becomes impossible. Both forms are diseases of absence, of a diet shaped by what was affordable to ship rather than what the body actually requires. Over that season, more than 40 workers died on the site and on the transport routes between the site and the nearest settlement. 40 is a number that reads like a statistic until you translate it into individuals. 40 separate moments or terminal clarity. 40 men who understood, at different points across different days, that they were going to die in a place that had never been designed to keep them alive because someone in an office had decided that full rations were an unnecessary expense. If the first season was a catastrophe, the second was something that required a different word, one that implied human decision-making rather than circumstance. Eventually, even the company's commercial momentum could not absorb the accumulating weight of its own choices. Operations suspended. The machinery sat in the jungle and rusted. The site returned to the state the jungle had been patiently preparing for it since the first shovel broke ground. For years, the story remained contained within the administrative records of companies and colonial offices, in the category of regrettable incidents that occur at a distance from the people responsible for them. Workers with no political representation are easy to forget. The dead in the Katanga interior had no advocates in Brussels. It was only later, when journalists began assembling the documented evidence,
that the case developed enough gravity to enter a courtroom. In 1934, French and Belgian newspapers began publishing accounts under headlines that translated roughly as "The Abandoned Workers of the Congo." Legal proceedings followed, conducted in the formal language of corporate liability and worker compensation, the attempt of an institutional system to retrofit accountability onto decisions made in its name. In March 1936, 5 years after the first convoy drove away, a verdict was delivered. The company was found liable. Marguerite and surviving workers were promised compensation. Justice, on paper, had been administered.
Paper promises have a history in places like Katanga. The company restructured under a related entity and entered a prolonged insolvency process. The compensation was never distributed. Marguerite and the surviving workers received what the jungle had always offered: survival, followed by abandonment in a cleaner administrative form. Today, the site is reclaimed. The jungle has done what jungles do when humans stop pushing back, which is to simply continue. Vines have threaded through the machinery that was too heavy to remove. The reinforced storage building has collapsed inward. A small memorial exists in the regional capital, a modest acknowledgement that the people who died there had names, and that those names belong in the record somewhere. The memorial does not convey what the humidity conveys. It does not explain what it means to stand in a clearing, waiting for a vehicle that your own body is telling you will not come, maintaining the discipline of hope against accumulating evidence that hope has been misplaced. St. Paul isn't the only story like this. Katanga isn't either. The pattern is older and wider than any single incident. 8 workers trusted a timeline and a company document. They believed the institutional world keeps its word, that if 90 days is the stated commitment, 90 days is what you get. They discovered instead the older operating principle: distance makes forgetting easy. The cost of that forgetting is paid by the people who were left, not the people who left them. The jungle did not invent beriberi or scurvy. It did not design an inoperable radio or under-provision the food supply. Those were decisions made in offices, in daylight, by people with complete information and better options, decisions that became catastrophic only for the people who were already too far away to object. And still the details survive. Armand's legs swelling in the lamplight, Bernard reading a medical pamphlet that described his own death, Edouard fading while Marguerite watched, Gerard walking toward the eastern perimeter and not coming back, Jules on the convoy, not looking behind him, Marguerite staying because staying was the only choice the situation left her with. They were not symbols of colonial exploitation, though they were that too. They were workers who believed a promise and paid for it with everything a person can pay. The jungle is just one kind of place where this happens. The world contains many others. Remembering this one is the smallest possible act of refusing to look away.